series has been about those various ways that are unique to all of us, that we know we're going within, we're looking at the work. What is the work? And that's going to mean different things for each of us. But in a broader sense, it might mean the ways in which we are trying to learn or understand ourselves better. The ways in which we are trying to become kinder, maybe a little less reactive. That as Roger reminded us of all these decisions we get to make, that the work is in some way trying to make those better choices, trying to show up more fully with love in each of those decisions. And so over the last couple of weeks, we've explored this through a couple different frames. First week, we talked about understanding the difference between what we can control and what we cannot control. Last week, we talked about our bodies, how so much of the work shows up in our bodies, in the emotions we feel, and how they live and are stored in these bodies. And so today, I want to take it even further. I want to really explore into the nitty-gritty. What does it mean to do the work moment to moment when things come up in our lives? Because things will come up. Every one of us, we have triggers. We have sensitive spots. We have interactions that just do something to us, right? We have types of interactions that we maybe avoid because of how they make us feel. Maybe you have a person in your life that is a sore subject. Maybe it's a person you know. Maybe it's a person you don't even know. You watch on TV, you see on the news, and they trigger you. Maybe maybe there is an institution that triggers you. Maybe it's political, maybe it's religious, maybe a religion or something from your upbringing and your religious background. Maybe seeing something about that just brings up feelings. There's wounds, right? Maybe it's your family. It seems to be a sensitive area for a lot of us. The spiritual teacher Ram Dass, he understood this quite well. He's famous for saying, if you think you're enlightened, go and spend a week with your family. That will bring a lot of clarity really fast. Now, if you are new today, you might be wondering, this is a spiritual community, right? So what is spiritual about talking about your emotions, your feelings, your triggers? Where's the spirituality there? For me, I find the way I like to look at it is there anything more spiritual than being with whatever comes up for us in each moment, being present with our experience, having the courage to look at the areas in our lives that might be sore, that might be sensitive, and doing so in order to open up our hearts into more love, more compassion, more of a connection with the world around us. And in order to do that, we need to delve into the uncomfortable from time to time. Because if you're living this life, if you're showing up as a human being, I think it's only natural that we're going to come up against those edges, those walls, those things that lead us into territory that is less than comfortable and easy for us. I think of life sometimes as a game of operation. As much as we try to avoid it, we come up against the edge and we hit the buzzer and something happens that is less than pleasant. Do you remember this game? Did you play this game growing up? It's been a while since I played this game, so I needed to do a little refresher. I did some research this week, and I was reminded that the board game, the original, the guy is named Cavity Sam. I don't know if you knew that, and he's portrayed as fully nude from 1965 to 2008. They just portrayed him as a nude guy on this board game for kids, and then in 2008 they put boxers on him. So that has nothing to do with anything. I just found that really interesting. So, moving on. We all have those things. We all have those sensitivities. We all have those triggers. We all have those wounds. We all have those things that, like a game of operation, when you get too close to the edge, the buzzer goes off. And what happens? We have an emotional reaction. We have a bodily reaction. And yet there's maybe some good news here. that instead of seeing these moments as a problem, what if we begin to see them as pointing us in the direction of our work, in the direction of our possible healing and our possible freedom? Pema Chödrön says, feelings like disappointment, embarrassment, irritation, resentment, anger, and jealousy. And fear. Anyone ever felt any of these before, right? You familiar with any of these? Okay. These are moments that teach us where it is that we're holding back. There is a teaching here. They show us where we could be more free. We could experience more wholeness in our lives. So what if instead of avoiding these things, avoiding the triggers, avoiding the thorns, what if we brought awareness to them? Right? Instead of saying like, oh, jealousy, here we go again. You could go, jealousy. Interesting. I wonder what this jealousy comes from, right? Oh, irritation. Interesting. Right? What does this mean? Why am I irritated right now? Oh, embarrassed. Look at me. I'm embarrassed. Oh, interesting. Look at that. This embarrasses me. Okay. And what we can do is we can switch from judgmental, right? From a judgmental mindset, instead of being the judge of our own lives, we can switch into curiosity, being more of a curious detective, just curious, investigating our own experience in effort to understand ourselves, right? Which may lead us to more freedom, more lightness, ultimately to healing, to wholeness. Carl Jung said that anything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. So we're going to have plenty of opportunities to learn more about ourselves, are we not? Right? Bring it on. Bring on the irritation. Bring on the annoyances, right? We may know about physical allergies, right? A lot of us, especially in the last month, have dealt with physical allergies, but there's also things in our life that are almost like emotional, spiritual allergies, right? You're like, I just can't do that thing. I can't be around that person. I can't deal with that topic. We all have things that we want to distance ourselves from, that we want to avoid, that we dislike. But what if there's an opportunity there? One of my favorite TV shows, and I think it's probably the most wholesome show on television. It's called Love on the Spectrum. Does anyone watch this show? Yeah, there you go. Clap, yeah. It's a beautiful television show about people on the autism spectrum who are finding love or who are in relationships and how they navigate those dynamics. Wonderful show. And one of my favorite parts is whenever they introduce a new character to the show, they say, this is so-and-so, they like something and they dislike something. So they introduce them based on their likes and their dislikes. So they might be like, this is Dylan, he likes trains and he dislikes people chewing popcorn too loudly in the movie theater. And it's such a relatable part of the show because I think every one of us, right, whether you're on the autism spectrum or not, we all have those things that we like, but then those things that just we cannot handle, we cannot deal with. Like, my name is Jake. I like hiking. I hate the feeling of putting sunscreen on. I just hate it. There's nothing worse. Being at the beach, right? I love being at the beach, but then I know I have to put sunscreen on. It's just the worst feeling. So we all have those things that we naturally have aversions to. Now, of course, this can be minor things like people chewing with their mouth open. It can be major things like betrayal or loss, things that we all naturally have an aversion to because it's our human state to want to avoid suffering. But there tends to be this reality that for each of us, there's going to be a unique way that we relate to the world and a unique set of things that might be difficult for each of us. So when it comes to the work, it's very specialized. It can be very individualized. And what might be the work for me might be the opposite kind of work for you. I'll give you an example. How many of you out there, part of what you're working on is you might be in a situation, right, where your feelings are hurt or something happens and your tendency is to shut down, is to not stand up for yourself, is to not speak up, and your work is learning how to speak up, is learning how to take up space, is learning how to use your voice. Does anyone feel like this is maybe their work in life, that this is something that they're working on and growing on? Now, there are folks for where it is the opposite, that maybe for you, when something happens, when you are triggered and you're offended, your immediate response is to say something, is to defend, is to interject yourself into a situation. And perhaps your work is to know when not to speak. Does anyone feel like this might be some of the work that you're doing, right? So it can be both. Your work might be to learn how to speak up. Your work might be to learn how to let others speak first. It could be both. Sometimes in a single human life, it's certainly both. I know for me, I deal with both. There are times where things happen and I shut down. I feel fear, I feel anxiety, and I don't feel like I'm able to stand up for myself. And I know that in those moments, the courageous thing to do would be to speak up. There are other moments where I can see myself immediately wanting to have a response, immediately wanting to say the right thing or show that I know what's going on in a situation, and my work is to not speak. So the way in which we respond, what we're being invited to do, is largely going to be specific to whatever you're going through. It's largely up to you. But what is important, and I think Roger really explained this really beautifully with this idea of all the choices that we have. What's important is to understand where it's coming from, to recognize that in these moments, whatever your response needs to be, that in these moments where things come up, where we're triggered, where we feel inflamed, where we feel like we need to have some kind of response, it's important to recognize that we always have a choice, that there's time and there's space to reflect, to be contemplative, to ask ourselves, what are the values from which I'm operating from? We always have a choice rather than living from a place of reactivity. And I think that Viktor Frankl, the author of Man's Search for Meaning, explained it in one of the best, simplest ways I've ever seen. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. So we recognize the power that happens in that space, the potential, the possibility for growth that simply happens when we recognize that I don't need to live out of reactivity, but that there is always time and space. Even if it feels brief in a moment, there's always time and space, and we have a choice. Friends, it's not about getting that response perfect, because that's rarely going to happen. It's not always about having the right response. How many of you have been in a conflict, or you were in some kind of situation, you gave your response, and then 5 minutes later, you're like, oh, I just thought of the perfect thing I should have said. Oh my gosh, I wish I could go back in time and say that thing, right? And you're like, it's too late, it's too late. But that's not what this is about. This is simply about the recognition that there exists a space. And in that space, there is growth and there is freedom, because we always have a choice. When we are living out of reactivity, we are essentially unconscious. Because that space, it gets squashed down to nothing. We all know that feeling. Something takes over. We're offended. We're insulted. And something takes over and we respond immediately. But what if we could start to see those offenses as opportunities to go deeper, to create that space, and to understand ourselves and why we might be feeling the way we are feeling instead of immediately reacting. And the opportunity that this presents is to really learn about ourselves on a deep, deep level. And so to do that, I want to explain a little bit about what is actually going on deep beneath the surface. I want to talk about cubs and cabs. Okay, these are acronyms. A cub is a core unconscious belief. A core unconscious belief. It's core because it actually holds a lot more power in our life than we realize. And yet it's unconscious because quite often we don't even know it's there. These are things that they come from our childhood or early on in our lives. And these are really simple, profound beliefs that shape the way we interact with the world, whether we realize it or not. A core unconscious belief may be something like this: I'm bad. I'm unlovable. I'm too much. I'm not enough. I'm not safe in the world. Often we don't realize that we hold beliefs like this because we don't necessarily go through life operating out of these beliefs. It would be too painful to walk through life thinking, I'm too much. I'm just too much. Everyone thinks I'm too much. So what we do is we find ways to try to fix or avoid that feeling. We compensate for it. This is where the cabs come in. We have compensating actions and beliefs. In other words, we have ways that we try to fix these feelings. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that you have this core unconscious belief that you are too much. You are too needy. A compensating action and belief might be living in the world in such a way where you are so independent, so self-sufficient that no one would ever dare think that you have needs or that you are needy, right? You're compensating for this worry that, am I too much? By saying, I'm never going to let anyone ever think I'm too much. I'm going to be so independent and self-sufficient. I'm not going to need anybody. When I was 8 years old, I took a snowboarding class. Now, caveat, if you haven't met, you know, something to know is that I'm not the most athletic person, and certainly when it comes to winter sports, that is not my thing. But I was taking this class, I was having a really hard time. I was sitting on my butt, couldn't even get my board on properly. I'm trying to stand up, couldn't do it. All the other kids have ridden off, and I'm freaking out, I'm panicking, and I looked to one of the teachers who was still there, and I said, can you help me? I'm stuck. And he looked down at me, and he said, you're a little high maintenance, aren't you? Oh. Now, about 24, 25 years later, that still burns a little bit, right? I still feel it. And through that and through other situations that have happened, I did grow up feeling like I was high maintenance, I was too much. So I spent the rest of my life trying to be so self-sufficient and independent that no one would ever think that of me again. Now, maybe you're on the other side of the spectrum. Maybe you grew up feeling like you were not enough, right? Not that you were too much, you were never enough. And so what might a person who doesn't feel like they're enough do to compensate? Well, they might try to be perfect all the time, right? Any perfectionists out there, you can probably relate to this, that if you could just be perfect all the time, no one would ever question whether or not you are enough because you're doing everything. You're being everything everyone needs you to be, right? The problem is that through these cabs, through these compensating actions and belief, we exhaust ourselves because all we're doing is trying to make sure that no one ever makes us feel that deep core unconscious belief that lives underneath. But here's the reality. We live human lives. We're here on planet Earth. They will sometimes make you feel that. Life is going to cause you to feel it. This is what the triggers are, right? If you're going around and you're living your life trying to be perfect so that you never have to feel like you're not enough, someone's going to come along that doesn't think you're perfect, right? We've all had that. Or something's going to happen that's going to make you feel like you failed. Or maybe you're someone who you live your life trying to be self-sufficient, never needing anyone because you're afraid of being seen as too much. Well, life is going to hand you situations where you're going to need someone, right? Or you may be seen as needy sometimes. That's just how it is. This is why relationships are the crucible for our growth, right? Because relationships are a mirror, right? Whether it's family, whether it's friendships, often most intensely it can happen in our long-term romantic partnerships because we are seen in such a way, and those people can hold the key to our understanding by often triggering us more than anyone else. That is just how it is. But our freedom can also start there. Our freedom can come with the trigger, because the trigger, it leads us all the way back to those beliefs that are deep at the core, and we can start to ask ourselves, what am I actually defending? What am I actually protecting in this moment? Right? So you're a perfectionist, and your perfectionism ultimately fails you, right? It can never actually permanently protect you from feeling those deeper feelings, right? So that perfectionism fails, and you can ask yourself in that moment, what am I so afraid of? What am I so afraid of if I actually wasn't perfect all the time? What would happen, right? Or the opposite, right? You try to be so independent and self-sufficient so no one ever thinks you have needs. What would happen if you said, well, what if I did have needs? What would that mean? What would that look like? This, I believe, is a line of curiosity, of questioning, of possible spiritual practice that can be so unbelievably healing. It takes time, it takes effort, but we can start to know ourselves on a deeper and deeper level. Friends, it doesn't mean that we can immediately fix all of our issues, right? There is no quick fix. I wish it was that way, but maybe that's not how it works. Maybe it doesn't happen overnight, but maybe we just get to understand where to start, and maybe that's enough. Right after Easter, I got sick, and it tended to linger for quite a long time. I didn't understand what was going on. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. I went to see multiple doctors, had different tests, and finally, after about a month, it was still lingering, and so I got one more blood test, and I got the results back, and I had valley fever. And if you don't know what valley fever is, it's pretty specific to the Southwest. It's a fungus that lives kind of in the dirt. It's not contagious because you just get it from that fungus, and it's pretty common, or it's very kind of specific to this part of the world, and it can go undetected because it's not something that people often think to look for. Now, when I got that diagnosis, it put a smile on my face for two reasons. Here's why. First reason, now that I've had valley fever, I can officially say that I am a true Tucsonan. Does we agree? Yes. Yes. Thank you. But the other reason that I was relieved is because after months of not really knowing what to do, how to take care of myself, where to start, I had some semblance of a direction to go. It wasn't that in that moment I was completely healed, but I knew where to start. And that is what this work is, right? We don't necessarily experience that healing and that freedom all at once, but when we know where to start, when we can be curious about what's going on inside, that can sometimes make all the difference, right? So I look back at my childhood and I realize how that ultimately led me to a place in my life where I try to avoid ever being seen as needy, ever being seen as high maintenance. And what that's led me to become is the type of person who could show up at a restaurant and they could bring out my food, and my food could have rusty nails in it. And I could say, oh, it's interesting what the chef chose to do with it today. You know what I mean? I was like, oh, that broken glass, that looks, that's a cool, interesting choice. Sometimes the universe puts you with, especially like in relationships, the universe might put you with the opposite type of person just to help you grow, right? Like how many of you are in a relationship where you're the kind of person where you would never say anything at a restaurant ever, and you're with someone who has no problem speaking up, right? Sometimes this is cosmic balance, right? I have this, but what I realize in those moments is that what's actually happening is there's a fear of being too much, right? And so I recognize, what would it be like to take up a little more space? What would it be like to actually be okay with having some needs? Because we're human, we're all allowed to have some needs. We're human, we're all allowed to not be perfect. So, you might be out there, you might be saying, well, why not just go the other way entirely? Why not just avoid these things like the plague, right? Because if you have an itchy sweater, you just don't have to wear it, right? You could just throw it away. Right? If you don't like Taylor Swift, you don't have to listen to Taylor Swift, right? So why do we just not avoid these things? Well, when it comes to the outside world, the external world, the physical and material things in our life, to a certain degree, we can avoid things. We can, there are things that we don't need to deal with if we don't want to deal with. But when it comes to our internal world and our internal experience, avoidance is not an effective long-term strategy. Stephen Hayes was a psychotherapist who developed the field of acceptance and commitment therapy. And he says avoidance is the best short-term strategy to escape suffering, but the best long-term strategy to guarantee suffering. right? We can avoid, and in the short term, it might feel good. We don't have to feel the pain, but over time, right, over time it accrues. It doesn't actually go anywhere. Michael Singer wrote a book called The Untethered Soul, and in this book, he has a great illustration for what happens when we avoid pain in the short term and what it creates for us in the long term. You might have read this book. You might have heard this illustration. I may have even said it before, but I think it's so powerful that I thought I'd share it again. He talks about these triggers as though they are thorns, right? He says, imagine you're walking in the woods one day and you get a thorn in your arm, and you feel as though, I don't want to deal with that short-term pain of removing the thorn. So instead, I'm going to keep the thorn in. I'm going to avoid ever irritating it. I'm going to avoid ever touching it, right? But of course, that's not a great long-term strategy. So this, you find different clothing that can never irritate the thorn. But eventually, the clothing's going to get snagged on something, and the thorn's going to get hit. So you're like, well, let me create like a suit of armor around the thorn. So the thorn never has to be bothered. And sure, it makes dating a little harder, but you do what you have to do so that you never disturb the thorn. But even if you have this big arm piece that's made of whatever it's made of, eventually that's going to get hit by something, and that's going to still disturb the thorn. So eventually you make an entire bodysuit that's robotic and mechanical so that you never have to disturb the thorn. And of course, what he's basically saying is that when we live our lives, avoiding the short-term pain of dealing with our wounds, of dealing with our triggers, and instead, when we build all this structure and scaffolding to avoid ever having to experience discomfort, ever having to experience challenge, ever having to actually confront our core unconscious beliefs, we end up spending so much more time and energy and suffering, and we end up in isolation. We end up making our lives smaller and smaller and smaller, because the reality is, friends, we are all covered in thorns, because that is what it means to be human. And while it is our tendency to avoid the thorns, they end up running our lives. So what would it look like to face the thorns, to allow that awareness, to have some courage and say, what is actually here? And can I be with this? Can I even endure the uncomfortable and even the pain of working with this in the present moment so it doesn't have to live and fester and run my life forever? This is what it means to do the work. This is what it means to have the courage to face the uncomfortable, to face the thorns, to face our wounds, to face our triggers. Now, I want to be clear about something, because as we've had these conversations about doing the work, some people have asked me, what does it mean to do the work when you might have people in your lives who are causing real harm, right? Or you need to have real boundaries with. Like when you're facing your thorns, and especially when it comes to others, right? Does it mean you just let people walk all over you? And I want to be clear that doing your internal work and recognizing that you have a responsibility to your own experience and your own reactions does not mean that we have to live passively, right? Or we need to be a pushover, because doing your internal work does not mean that we simply allow harmful behavior in our lives. I'll give you an example, right? When I first moved to the Southwest, I had a fear of rattlesnakes. I still have a bit of a fear of rattlesnakes, but I had even more of a fear. And I recognized, I'm moving into their territory. They're not doing anything wrong. So this fear is my own to deal with, right? I can just work with that and understand that, it brings up certain things in me. But just because I recognize that fear is my own and the responsibility to work on it is my own, it doesn't mean that if I come across a rattlesnake on the road that I'm going to bend down and say, hey, buddy, come climb on my neck, We can do the work and still be wise. We can do the work and still protect ourselves where we need to, because sometimes, friends, the work for you is going to be to create boundaries. It's hard. It's hard to know. We can do our best, but we're always going to make mistakes. We're human. We're not always going to get it right. And friends, a person who is doing the work is not a person without triggers or without thorns. A person who is doing the work is not always aware in every moment. A person doing the work does not always react perfectly. But maybe doing the work means that you keep trying. right? You don't give up. Because maybe it's not perfection we're going for, it's just that we keep showing up. Jon Kabat-Zinn said that the work of mindfulness is not to create a perfect life, it's to help us meet an imperfect life with greater presence and less resistance. Right? Maybe that's a breath of fresh air. Maybe that's a sigh of relief for you. That it's not about creating perfection. It's about showing up with perfection, in imperfection, or showing up and accepting the imperfection of our lives. So friends, where are you meeting your life with presence? Where can you meet your life with less resistance? Where can you meet your wounds and your thorns with compassion and curiosity? I want to do a little practice of this. If you feel comfortable, we can close your eyes. You can just rest a soft gaze. I just want to take a moment. As you find yourself comfortable, as we take some deeper, slower breaths together, I want you to just take an opportunity to think about this past week. And maybe as we're talking about the wounds and the thorns, the triggers and the challenges, maybe something has come up for you. Maybe something that happened this past week where you didn't react the way you would like to react. Or something hurt you, something offended you, something dysregulated your nervous system. And I want to just take an opportunity for us to re-examine that moment from a place of safety, of love, of non-judgment, but of curiosity. And maybe in that moment you can ask yourself, what might be a core unconscious belief that I'm actually being shown by this reaction? What did I really need in this moment? Maybe what I really needed is just some compassion for myself. Maybe what I needed is to remind myself that I am safe, that I am enough, that I'm not too much, that my wounds don't define me. And as you re-experience this moment from a place of love, from a place of compassion, from a place of heightened awareness and expanded curiosity, we can recognize that this is what that space looks like. That space between something happening and us responding to it. That there is a deep well of compassion and curiosity within each of us. And this is what it feels like to take even a moment to check in with ourselves, to tend to ourselves before we react and before we respond. And so as you hold on to what this feels like, we invite this feeling, this curiosity, this loving presence and awareness to be with us in our week ahead, because moments will come, things will happen, right? But we can meet it with a little more compassion and curiosity and love. So when you feel ready and comfortable, take your time, but when you feel comfortable, you can open your eyes. This is the work. It's not always easy. It's not always fun. But look how just in that moment, you begin to rewrite your story in a way that can change your world.